So in this video, we're going to be covering a lot of information. For that reason, throughout this whole thing, there will be timestamps down below in a pinned comment if I remember, but otherwise definitely in the description. Effectively, what we're going to be looking at is a recent leak that may have accidentally revealed the Outer Worlds release date. We'll talk about that first because it's probably one of the most interesting pieces. But then even further, over the past week, we actually got a ton of new information about this game regarding several different systems, both as far as the setting goes, some of the humor in the game, the companion systems, and even a pretty in-depth look at weapons, specifically science weapons. There's a lot of really interesting stuff here, and I tried to summarize a ton of information in a fairly small package. It definitely is a long video, but trust me, reading through this all on your own would take a lot longer. Almost all of this stuff is actually coming from the exclusive Game Informer coverage, so if you guys do want to check that out, I will have a link to it down below. But either way, starting things off, let's actually look at this potential release date leak around the Outer Worlds. As it stands right now, the only thing we know is the Outer Worlds is set to come out in 2019, obviously fairly vague. But just yesterday, we actually got an update on the Steam store page. It seems like for just a couple of hours, there was a release date set on the Outer Worlds Steam store page of August 6th, 2019. That being just a little bit over 5 months from now. So naturally, take that with a grain of salt. Pretty much all release date leaks are always pretty iffy. Sometimes they end up being really accurate, but it feels like most of the time they tend to be pretty inaccurate. Although there are a few components of this one that gets me a bit more hopeful. First and foremost, it's coming from Steam. A lot of the times we see release date leaks, it comes from various retailers. But this time it's from the Steam store page, a page that is pretty much just maintained by the developer of this game themselves. But even further, August 6th is a Tuesday, that being the day most video games are released. Perhaps Obsidian with the Outer Worlds is trying to avoid a holiday 2019 release date because that always is a very crowded time, while the summer tends to be a little bit more spacious, especially in August. But again, alternatively, this could have just been an accident, it could be a placeholder release date, or it could just literally be a random date that was accidentally imported when they were importing some other data. Either way, I'm pretty hopeful. I have to imagine that either leading up to E3 or maybe even at E3 itself, we will get the official release date announced. But moving on, let's actually look at some of the other new information that has recently come out around the Outer Worlds. So just a couple of days ago, we actually got some footage of a bunch of new combat gameplay in the Outer Worlds. I made a full video on that, you can check it out in the little eye if you're interested. But in this article, we actually got some different details. Rather this time, they give us quite a bit of information around science weapons, which are one very unique weapon type that does appear in this game. Gunplay in the Outer Worlds is described as mostly serious. It normally follows traditional rules and is meant to feel at least somewhat realistic. With science weapons in this game, that's all meant to be thrown out the window. The goal with science weapons is to have them be very rare and fairly hard to get, but at the same time have really inexplainable and funny effects that also are quite effective. There's no intention of realism behind these ones. So the one Game Informer actually got to look at was actually the shrink ray. We got quite a few different things around this, whether it actually be a nice 360 view of the model, or even further other things like just some of the images of it in action, as well as details as to how it works specifically. So obviously, it being called the shrink ray, it is going to shrink enemy creatures as long as you are actively using it. So it's basically a beam weapon, and as you're shooting the enemy, they will be shrunken down. This is going to do a couple of things. It'll deal minor damage over time. It'll actually increase the pitch of all sound effects coming from that enemy, but also what is described as potentially one of the most effective things around this, it'll actually reduce the damage resistance of that enemy. And this is very much so a no bars weapon. If you see some giant and daunting creature, you can still shrink ray it. The creators of this game say there really are no limits as to what you can use this on or can't. Everything is pretty much applicable here. This is the only science weapon Game Informer got to look at closely, but we heard about the name of one other one as well as details about science weapons in general. Apparently one of the other weapons in the game is actually known as the ugly stick. It's not explicitly clear what that does, but you can assume maybe it'll make another character appear ugly and that gives them some kind of debuff. In the past, Obsidian has said that the science weapons in this game sometimes actually form out of bugs, so maybe it'll have some kind of body dysmorphism going on there. But one guiding rule they had with all of the implemented science weapons is to have them be crazy. There was actually several ones that were cut because they simply weren't crazy enough. But even further, these aren't going to be weapons that are just handed to you. Oftentimes, to actually get them, you're going to have to go off the main path, maybe do a couple of side quests or just explore an unprecedented area. Some are easier to find than others, but overall, as a category, science weapons are meant to be particularly rare. There also are only 5 in the game. As of right now, there's going to be 1 for every weapon category. So that's going to be light melee, heavy melee, handguns, which will be the shrink ray, long guns, as well as heavy guns. Although Obsidian does mention that through DLC, it's likely this could be something that gets expanded on, but these science weapons are actually fairly unique in more ways than one. One of the major themes in the Outer Worlds, which I'll talk about more later in this video, is corporate culture. Pretty much all the other weapons you use have a brand associated with them, and that really defines what that weapon's going to be. Whether it be Spacer's Choice and very cheap, but also breaks very quickly, or one of the other brands that makes it highly modifiable. With science weapons, it's not like that. Each is going to be one-off, and you're not going to find any logos on it. But even further, also unlike other weapons, science weapons get benefits from the science skill. The science skill isn't going to be a typically combat-focused skill. So Obsidian describes it as, you might have a character that's really trying to be a scientist in the game, and thus he'll also be particularly good with science weapons, but not necessarily good with any other weapons. Alternatively, if your character is just a traditionally combat-focused character, he probably won't be particularly good with science weapons. Another thing they mention is you could actually give these science weapons to your companions, although they say your mileage may vary with that. One pretty interesting mechanic they actually share about weapons overall that will be applicable to science weapons is they're actually going to have an inherent level. It very much so seems like this inherent level on each weapon in the game is going to be pretty much identical to Fallout 76's leveling system. You could apparently tinker with the weapons and increase the level, and different leveled weapons will have different damage values. So higher level weapons will do more damage, and you could actually change that after you acquire a science weapon. But even beyond that, Obsidian also talks about how you could actually play the Outer Worlds in your own way. I think this is by far one of the most exciting parts of this game. There's a lot of really cool components of it, but the replayability and just the choices you have so far, to me at least, seem like some of the most interesting. So overall, Obsidian definitely wants people to play their own way. This is going to take 2 main approaches. One, in the gameplay mechanics themselves, whether you go for a sneak or charisma build, or even just a guns blazing build, but also in the overall narrative of the story that does form around your individual character. A lot of the choices and decisions you're going to encounter in this game won't be clear-cut either good or bad. There's going to be way more of a gray area there. The way to describe this is basically for some of the choices, the short-term outcome will be negative, but over the long term, it may actually end up saving more people. A lot of these decisions are not as much clear-cut, oh, that's the good choice and this is the bad choice, but rather that this is the choice that leads to that thing, and it's, do I value that thing more than this other option? They also discuss how many of the choices you make in this game are going to be tracked, and it will affect future outcomes in the game. This won't put you down set paths, it'll just affect the context of when you actually get to certain milestones. One example they give is early on in the game, you're going to have to get a power regulator, but the way you get that isn't really defined for you. There's actually a lot of options. During this quest, you might just go the route of buying it with your hard-earned money. You might go the route of just stealing it. Maybe you'll work with the people that do have it and they'll actually just give it to you after your job well done. But even further, there's going to be several different power regulators and you'll have options as to which one you want to attempt to go for. And that's really just the narrative part of choice all along the way. During that, you're also going to have the gameplay mechanics, how you're actually speccing out your character. But then they also touch on the universe of the Outer Worlds, and this one is particularly interesting. It's been a while since Fallout New Vegas, and a lot of people have been waiting for Obsidian to get their hands on another RPG experience like this one. One of the interesting parts about the story, and really the protagonist of this, that being your own character you control, he's meant to be just as much as an outsider as you as the player. In the story, the character you actually create in the game was recently unfrozen, so he's never seen the colony that you eventually end up going into. It is meant to be odd and have cultural differences, so your character will react to that just like you do in real life. This is going to be an alternate history game, meaning that things that actually happened in history didn't happen in this game necessarily. It seems like the split is actually around when Einstein came to power, so right around the time of corporate America with trust busting and some of the robber barons you probably heard about. The notable difference in the Outer Worlds was there was no trust busting. Nobody was trying to break up the monopolies or fight for employee rights. Rather, in this, the corporations are some of the most powerful things, and people are meant to be very allegiant to that. In the Outer Worlds, one of the most important things people do in life is money making. As a result, there's a bunch of classism, and the banks and corporations are some of the most powerful things in the world, even more powerful than in today's world. It naturally is a space game, and effectively in the Outer Worlds, the people who were sending others into space weren't like the government or some different scientists looking to research it. It was big corporations looking to monetize it. So there was a period where people were buying up different colonies, and that's what brings us to the story of the Outer Worlds. Effectively, 10 different corporations came together to buy up one colony that was very far away from Earth. The reason they wanted to get one that was far away is they wanted to create a truly corporate utopia, where everyone in the colony, everyone on that planet really looked up to the corporation. This group of individuals that did decide to buy this colony is known as the board. Although one interesting part about this, even though that's where this game takes place on this particular colony, Obsidian describes how they actually wrote some of these stories for other colonies. Different planets in the area do have exports that they are giving out, as well as they actually have one story about a guy like a real world Bill Gates who bought a planet and a colony and literally just for himself. By the events of the Outer Worlds, it became very apparent that things weren't working out as intended in this colony. There are two separate planets here known as Terra 1 and Terra 2. Even though Terra 2, where you actually see a lot of the gameplay and sprawling towns, was fairly successful, now things are starting to degrade. Some of these structures are quite old. This takes place 70 years after they originally settled here, and the other planet never was actually terraformed. Colonization failed there, and that's going to be the planet where you actually see some of those crazy monsters. So in Terra 2, where a colony was successfully created, you're going to find a lot of people that are allegiant to corporations. There's going to be somewhat of a mix on the outer realms of towns. You'll still find marauders, but even further, the gameplay on these two separate planets is also different. On Terra 2, where you do find all of these allegiant people, you also will have a more linear gameplay. There's going to be various towns you can go to and giving you areas to explore, but it's not really an open world. On the other side of things, on Terra 1, now renamed to Monarch, where things didn't go as successfully, there actually is an open world. You're going to find some towns here not quite as built up, but in essence, these are going to be people that didn't really agree with the corporate culture. They're the outliers of this whole situation. They describe Monarch or Terra 1 as an open world, but it's not going to be a huge one. It's definitely on the smaller scale, but I actually think that's a very interesting dynamic. How there's one planet that really is a totally open world, even if a small one, and another one that actually just has more predefined areas. And even though those are the two main locations in the game, there's actually several other ones we will be able to go to. The ship that brought the first wave of colonists now acts as a space station and kind of a port for these colonies. On board there, you're actually going to find a bunch of criminals, but it is another location you can go to. There's an asteroid you can go to known as Scylla that has science labs as well as communication equipment, but most of it has been abandoned. And then even further, a maximum security prison on a planet known as Tartarus, as well as there's just going to be other planets with other stories. You won't actually be able to go to them, at least yet. But there is going to just kind of be a whole system around you, not just the planet you're on, but also you'll hear about some of the other ones in the area. Even further, as far as the colonized planet does go, there's going to be several different cities here. One of the most interesting ones we hear about is Byzantium. This is going to be the city for the rich, and it's actually gated. It's not like anyone could just go in it. It's described as having some deep secrets there, and I'm pretty curious as to how that plays out gameplay-wise. One of the other big stories they really focus on is the art of the game. The art style of the Outer Worlds is actually fairly unique, especially compared to other games. In this article, we actually get a ton of images of the various art as well as certain aspects of the game, which does look really nice, but they mention how they're really focusing on a frontier-esque style. In the Outer Worlds, as I just mentioned, you're going to a colony, someplace that is only recently created, with one planet still being quite wild. Even further, they actually expand on this load screen mechanic. This is a pretty cool new thing they're doing with this game. Basically, after you take an action in the game, load screens will have little headlines regarding that thing you just did. One thing we learn in this piece is that all these load screens are actually from media outlets that are controlled by the board. So if you do something that really helps out that faction, you'll be regarded as a hero or a savior. But if you do something against them, they will demonize you in these headlines. I think that's a really cool mechanic, and it's definitely something that's unique. But even further, another aspect that I really like is each of the major corporations in this game is going to have its unique art style. So when you see an armor like this, even though there'll be different variants for some of the different companies that do create it, you'll almost immediately be able to tell which company it was because of the color scheme it has going on. Even further, some of the local towns will also follow this color scheme, so you'll know which corporation owns that town. But even beyond that, we actually got a ton of details about companions, both on how companions are going to work and actually some specifics about certain companions, one of which we've never seen before. One thing they mention is that companions are actually mostly handled by one writer. So that's to say that all the companion dialogue was written by the same person, hopefully giving them a fairly uniform feel. I really like this, and I think that's a good approach to doing this. They go on to say that they deliberately confine the number of companions in this game, not having a ton, because they want them to be individualistic. They are going to be unique. You're not going to confuse two companions. Some of them will have very particular personalities, while other ones are more go with the flow. You also will encounter all of the companions within the first third of the game, so you can pick which two you want to tag along with you. But even further, if you don't know, basically companions are going to do a couple of things. First and foremost, they have their own special ability. They also will give you bonuses to certain stats depending on whatever they're good at, and you can customize this somewhat as they do level up. But even further, they're going to have one particular weapon category that they are proficient with. Companions will also have their own special quest. We've heard about this somewhat in the past, and here it's basically just described as being fairly short, but it's going to focus on an issue that is central to that companion. You get a little bit more of an understanding of them and more context around how they got to where they are. But at the same time, companions are totally optional, and they actually may leave you if you piss them off just a little bit too much. But describe the system of anger and companions not really as a traditional morality system. It's not like you're going to have to give them gifts so they stay with you, but rather pretty quickly in the game, you'll know the companion's personality and what they like and dislike. So you'll have a pretty good idea as you make major decisions in the Outer Worlds whether your companion will like that or dislike that. But also, if one does get angry and does begin to leave you, you could actually talk to them and try and justify your actions, or even use something like your persuasion skill to get them to stay. As far as some details on explicit companions, one we've seen quite a bit is Ellie. She's basically described as having a mercenary outlook on everything. She won't necessarily care if you take the bad guy route or do things that are selfish or for personal gain. In the past, we have seen some gameplay of her special ability in action, but we also do have Perbody, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong. This is like the polar opposite to Ellie. This is going to be somebody who really wants to help everyone. They will start to get upset if you continuously just serve your own selfish motives and don't try and help other people. We also have seen her special ability, which is basically just a big hammer smash, which interestingly, this probably ties into how she's kind of kind and giving. She doesn't actually take down enemies completely, rather just knocks them out and you have to finish them off. And then finally, Felix. This is basically going to be a younger kid who's just rebellious towards major powers. So he's constantly getting in fights, but will follow you pretty wholeheartedly and actually latch onto you fairly quickly. But then finally, to end off this video, one of the last major topics they do touch on is dark comedy in the Outer Worlds. They describe this as wanting to have a balance between dark undertones in this game, but not making it overly depressing, where you feel sad for weeks following the playthrough. But also that pretty much all of the comedy in this game serves a purpose, not just to be funny, but to actually reveal something. When a joke is made, it will tell you something about a character or a location or just a bit of backstory. They describe how there's a lot of times where you have to make a serious decision and there simply might not be a positive outcome there. All of the choices are fairly negative, but there might be some dark humor implemented also to kind of give a light side or for you to laugh about it somewhat. The creators of this game mention if you've enjoyed some of their past games, like some of the OG Fallout humor, you definitely will enjoy this one also. But even further, this is going to be one of those games that gets progressively darker as you gradually start to uncover what's actually going on, the underpinnings of what you're seeing. They also talk about how certain things are just silly, like this thing is going to be a wearable helmet that bobbles side to side, so wearable Moonman helmet is confirmed. Either way, that's pretty much going to wrap it up for this rather large video. We got a ton of new information around the game, and honestly, it just is continuously getting me more and more excited. I feel like this is one of those games that I was excited when I saw the trailer, but hearing more about it has only made me more excited, which is something I can't say about all games, particularly other releases in the same genre.